Robert De Niro was born in New York City in 1943 and came of age in a town where stages, storefronts, and street corners could all feel like classrooms. He was not manufactured by publicity but formed by practice, hours in studios, readings, and quiet work that drew more from discipline than noise. As a young actor, he absorbed the rigor of New York training under demanding teachers and learned to trust preparation as much as instinct. The turning point was less a single stroke of luck than a steady convergence of mentors and material, most visibly the collaborations that would anchor his early screen identity and teach him how to disappear into ordinary men with unordinary pressure points. From there, the ascent was deliberate. Roles that preferred truth over posture, choices that rewarded patience, performances that prized listening as an action. Audiences gravitated to the stillness and interiority. Directors trusted the reliability. Colleagues learned he was exacting without spectacle. The persona was not a pose but a working method, quiet, precise, and loyal to the frame. Away from cameras, he kept a modest perimeter, reserved in interviews, consistent with crews, protective of the process, shaping a reputation for steadiness more than myth. As eras shifted, he adapted without abandoning principles, allowing time to send down excess while keeping the core intact. Observe closely, decide carefully, and let the scene carry the weight. In this context, the public insistence on rivalry narratives never matched the internal compass that guided his choices. When conversation turned to Al Pacino, De Niro's view reflected the same code. Measure the work, not the noise. Respect the risk when it serves the story. Recognize different roads that reach the same standard. That is a foundation for what he later clarified about Pacino. Less revelation than correction, less contest than regard. Robert De Niro and Al Pacino are often bracketed together because of their impact on American film and their shared New York training culture, but their connection was not driven by competition. Their early paths moved in parallel, theater-grounded, teacher-driven, and built around character integrity. De Niro's approach leaned toward granular research and finely controlled physical and vocal choices. Pacino's toward calibrated volatility and dynamic emphasis. The difference is read as contrast from a distance, yet up close they served a similar aim, credibility. De Niro's later remarks about Pacino highlighted this alignment. The energy may differ, but the intention is the same, and the intention is what matters. Their first major shared credit, The Godfather Part II, 1974, placed them in the same film but in separate timelines. Pacino's Michael Corleone moved in the present. De Niro's young Vito occupied the past. The structure prevented a direct scene comparison and created a lasting narrative effect. Two actors carrying the same dynasty from different angles, reinforcing the sense of their careers were in dialogue even when their characters were not. De Niro's performance earned an Academy Award, and Pacino, already established by The Godfather, Serpico, and Dog Day Afternoon, consolidated his standing. Media framing leaned into a binary. Who was greater? Who defined the era? But neither actor fed the discussion. The absence of public sparring preserved ambiguity and kept attention on the films. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, both continued building bodies of work that shaped school curricula, rehearsal rooms, and studio expectations for lead actors. De Niro's reputation for immersive preparation and structural precision became a reference point for scene construction. Pacino's command of tempo, line pressure, and escalation became a reference point for scene ignition. De Niro has described Pacino in terms that emphasize commitment rather than volume, an acknowledgement that outward intensity is not a performance flourish, but a controlled instrument when applied with purpose. That reading rejects the simple quiet versus loud framing and replaces it with craft vocabulary, listening cues, beat management, and risk acceptance inside the scene. By the early 1990s, anticipation had grown for a direct on-screen exchange. The idea carried cultural weight because it promised to test two methods in the same air, at the same table, under the same lens. The significance was not about settling an argument. It was about letting audiences observe contrast within a single dramatic event. When that moment arrived, it would clarify more than any interview could how each actor sets a rhythm, how each adjusts to the other's choices, and how restraint and attack can produce the same dramatic gravity when both are anchored in character logic. The groundwork for what De Niro later articulated about Pacino is visible across these decades. Two careers built on seriousness rather than slogans, two vocabularies aimed at the same destination, and two actors who understood that longevity is earned by serving the story. What follows in their shared work is less a verdict and more a case study. The truth, as De Niro frames it, is that Pacino's courage with moment-to-moment risk, when tethered to the spine of the character, advances the scene. Respect follows naturally from that outcome. The next chapter begins when they finally share the frame and allow method to meet method without commentary, letting the work speak for them both. The long-anticipated moment where Robert De Niro and Al Pacino would finally meet within the same narrative space occurred with Heat in 1995. The film did not simply bring two major actors together. It placed them in roles that required direct psychological engagement. De Niro portrayed Neil McCauley, a disciplined professional thief whose life is defined by controlled decision-making and distance. Pacino played Lieutenant Vincent Hanna, an investigator whose work consumes him and whose emotional intensity is tied to the instability of his personal life. The structural purpose of the film was not to determine who dominated the screen, but to illustrate how two contrasting interior worlds recognize each other, study each other, and ultimately collide. The most discussed element of Heat is the coffee shop conversation between the two characters. It is a straightforward scene on the surface. Two men seated across from one another, speaking plainly about their lives, their goals, and the inevitability of conflict between them. However, what makes this moment singular is the clarity with which both actors maintain the internal conditions of their characters. De Niro's Neil remains measured, observing, calculating, constantly steering himself away from emotional vulnerability. Pacino's Hanna shifts tone, pace, and cadence as he probes for openings, pressing forward to establish control. Neither of them attempts to overpower the frame. Instead, each actor calibrates his performance in relation to the other's choices, creating a balanced tension that does not break. In later comments, De Niro acknowledged Pacino's effectiveness in that scene, noting that Pacino's performance approach allowed the conversation to retain its unpredictability. Pacino adjusted vocal pressure and emotional emphasis not for display, but to reflect Hanna's unstable lifestyle and fractured internal focus. De Niro's minimalism countered this by maintaining a stable emotional posture, representing Neil's self-regulation. The contrast did not create dissonance, it created mirror logic. Each character's strengths and weaknesses were reflected back by the other. This interaction is what De Niro pointed to when he later stated that Pacino commits fully and without hesitation, describing it not as excess but as deliberate interpretation. Following Heat, public commentary shifted from the idea of rivalry to the idea of duality. Critics began to recognize that the two actors were not opposites but complementary forces within the same tradition. Their careers did not challenge each other. They defined a standard for dramatic presence that extended beyond their individual filmographies. Film schools, workshops, and acting texts studied the Heat scene as an example of how two actors with distinct styles can construct a shared dramatic space without compromising authenticity. The performance became a reference point for demonstrating how listening, timing, and restraint determine the weight of dialogue more than volume or emphasis alone. Their next major collaboration occurred in Righteous Kill, 2008. Unlike Heat, the film positioned them as partners rather than adversaries. The narrative structure was more conventional, and the script centered on investigative procedure rather than internal conflict. The film received mixed critical responses, but the presence of De Niro and Pacino remained the primary point of interest. De Niro later acknowledged that Righteous Kill did not carry the same dramatic function as Heat, as its focus did not rely on psychological contrast or tension. However, the film demonstrated something else: the capacity of the actors to adjust their dynamic depending on narrative need. The pairing was not built on competition, but on professional coordination. The next significant collaboration arrived more than a decade later with The Irishman, 2019, directed by Martin Scorsese. The film was structured around memory, aging, and the gradual narrowing of personal choices across a lifetime. De Niro played Frank Sheeran, a man who carries out orders with emotional detachment, while Pacino portrayed Jimmy Hoffa, whose leadership style is rooted in charisma, certainty, and force of presence. The film required both actors to navigate performances that acknowledge time, consequence, and the weight of irreversible decisions. In this setting, Pacino's energy served as a driving force that moved the narrative forward, while De Niro's restraint functioned as the anchor that held the story's emotional framework in balance. In retrospective commentary, De Niro emphasized that Pacino's performance in The Irishman demonstrated the consistency of his craft, noting that Pacino's emotional intensity had never been uncontrolled, but intentionally structured. He described Pacino as an actor who understands rhythm, how to accelerate, hold, or release emotional pressure based on what the scene demands. This recognition reinforces the central truth De Niro sought to express. Pacino's approach is not improvisational chaos, but a disciplined application of emotional availability timed to narrative stakes. By the time The Irishman was released, both actors had achieved decades of cinematic impact, and discussion about rivalry had become obsolete. The public narrative shifted toward acknowledgement of legacy. De Niro and Pacino were not seen as opponents, but as contributors to a shared lineage that shaped the direction of performance style in modern film. Their work demonstrated that character depth results not from force or intensity alone, but from clarity of intention and consistency of internal motivation. The professional relationship between De Niro and Pacino, as articulated by De Niro, is built on respect for preparation, commitment to the demands of the role, and understanding of how to support the narrative structure of film. Their collaborations illustrate that acting at the highest level is not a contest of expression, but a coordinated effort to serve the story. The truth, in De Niro's own framing, is that Pacino is a disciplined actor who takes meaningful risks grounded in character logic. This acknowledgement defines the foundation of their partnership and corrects a common misconception that the two men were ever in competition for dominance or recognition. By the time Robert De Niro and Al Pacino reached the later stages of their careers, their influence on acting had already become part of the institutional memory of film. Their work was not measured only by awards or box office impact, but by the standards they helped establish. Acting schools examined their performances not for imitation, but for evidence of decision-making. Directors referenced their approach when shaping ensembles. Critics used their careers to define eras in cinema history. The two actors had moved beyond the cultural conversation of who was superior and entered a category reserved for foundational figures whose presence altered expectation for everyone who followed. The idea of rivalry had persisted among audiences partly because both actors maintained private personal lives and rarely commented on each other in media. Silence left space for speculation. However, when De Niro eventually addressed the subject directly, he dismantled the framing entirely. He stated that he had always respected Pacino, not as a counterpart to compare himself against, but as a performer who demonstrated total commitment to character truth. For De Niro, Pacino's intensity was not uncontrolled expression, but a chosen technique designed to reveal interior states that could not be communicated through minimal movement or quiet presence. De Niro viewed Pacino's approach as a disciplined instrument, not as contrast or contradiction to his own. This clarification reframed decades of public perception. De Niro emphasized that Pacino's performances were rooted in the same tradition of training and study that shaped his own work. Both actors emerged from environments demanding rigor, repetition, rehearsal, and the willingness to investigate emotional complexity. The differences in their styles, De Niro's internal stillness and Pacino's dynamic expression, were simply two valid responses to the same artistic objective. De Niro stated that what mattered was authenticity, not method uniformity. In his view, Pacino consistently achieved authenticity. Their shared legacy is also defined by the way they aged on screen. Many actors adapt by simplifying performances or relying on familiar tropes. De Niro and Pacino moved in the opposite direction. As they grew older, their work focused more on the consequences of past choices, the narrowing of personal horizons, and the emotional weight that memory imposes on identity. Their later roles often examined regret, durability, loyalty, and finality. The characters are portrayed no longer fought for power or recognition, but confronted the cost of the lives they had lived. This shift granted audiences the opportunity to see not only the skill of their performances, but the perspective that time had given them. The Irishman served as a particularly clear example of this evolution. Pacino's portrayal of Jimmy Hoffa was defined by force of personality and certainty of purpose. De Niro's Frank Sheeran was defined by detachment and silence. Together, the performances explored how conviction and loyalty can both sustain and destroy. The dynamic was not designed to recreate the tension of Heat or the historical parallel of The Godfather Part 2. Instead, it demonstrated how two actors could return to the screen decades later with renewed control of their abilities, adapting their methods to reflect the characters' internal timelines. In interviews surrounding the film, De Niro reiterated that Pacino remained committed to the demands of each role, adjusting his performance structure to serve the narrative rather than himself. The influence of De Niro and Pacino extended into cultural conversation about masculinity and emotional expression. Their characters often displayed vulnerability, conflict, fear, and doubt, qualities that earlier film eras tended to restrict. By portraying internal struggle without diminishing the strength of their roles, they reshaped the image of the American dramatic lead. Actors who came after them frequently cited both men as models for how to balance emotional openness with narrative weight. The impact was not stylistic imitation, but recognition of the value of psychological anchoring in performance. De Niro's final characterization of Pacino's contribution was consistent and direct. He described Pacino as an actor who does not hold back when a scene requires intensity, but does so only when it reflects the truth of the character. This statement rejected the simplified public narrative that Pacino's style could be defined by volume alone. It also clarified that De Niro viewed performance not as competition, but as collaboration. According to De Niro, Pacino elevates scenes by making decisive choices that deepen the stakes of the narrative. Respect, in this context, was not based on familiarity or friendship, but on recognition of professional discipline. As both actors move into the later period of their careers, their relationship became understood less as parallel fame and more as shared continuity. They represented a specific lineage in acting, one that valued preparation, character justification, and a refusal to reduce emotional complexity to spectacle. Their work demonstrated that enduring relevance in film requires adaptability without abandoning foundational principles. The truth that Robert De Niro revealed about Al Pacino is that Pacino's power as an actor comes from his willingness to pursue emotional clarity without hesitation when the character demands it. It is not unpredictability, it is commitment. It is not excess, it is interpretation. De Niro did not define Pacino by contrast to himself, but by the integrity of Pacino's method and the consistency with which he applied it across decades. Their careers are not mirrors or opposites. They are parallel expressions of the same pursuit, to portray human beings honestly, without simplifying the forces that shape them. This understanding forms a legacy that connects them. Two actors who approach their work with seriousness, discipline, and respect. Two careers that reshaped expectations of what screen acting could achieve, and a mutual acknowledgement that the highest measure of performance is not dominance but truth.